Thank you, Naseem. Good evening to you all. Thank you so much for having me. This is an honor, not least of which to be nominated among such a spectacular group of writers and in the company of luminaries. So thank you so much. And I'm especially excited because I get to address you at a particular moment, at a moment of protest across the globe. These years have been years of protest. Protest in Puerto Rico that forced its governor, Ricardo Rosselló, to resign. Nearly 8 months of protests deposed Sudan's president, Omar al-Bashir. Protests are ongoing in Honolulu, Hawaii, against the construction of a 30-meter telescope on Mauna Kea, a sacred site and a mountain for the Kanaka Maoli. In Chile, protesters sparked by a 3% hike in subway fares, which is equivalent to 4 US cents, have turned into a nationwide uprising against neoliberalism. And protesters have held up signs that say neoliberalism was born here and it shall die here. Children the world over have led protests against entrenched government policies, hurling us into sure devastation wrought by climate change. Children are leading us. A nominal tax on WhatsApp services has catapulted Lebanon into a united protest against corruption and sectarianism. كلٌ يعني كلٌ. In Iraq, after a decade of sanctions, 2 decades of war intervention, young Iraqis are demanding a credible and accountable leadership. A Hirak movement of young Algerians is protesting that the resignation of Abdelaziz Bouteflika is not enough, and they also demand the overhaul of the entire government. كلٌ يعني كلٌ. Excuse me, I can't say that in an Algerian dialect. And Palestinians this week will lead the 81st week of protest in the besieged Gaza Strip, demanding the right of return of Palestinian refugees, and fundamentally are demanding freedom. Absolutely, yes. We are living in a time of remarkable protest. We are literally bearing witness to history in the making, and a history that we've seen before during the apex of anti-colonialism, anti-imperial uprising of third world revolts between the early 1960s through the early 1980s. What is different today, perhaps, is that the PLO is not playing a central role in these people's protests, but instead there is a transnational network of Palestinian activists all over the world who are in Hawaii, who are in Australia, who are protesting in the Dakota Access Pipeline, who are obviously in Lebanon and in Gaza, who are building this movement, who are in the United States, who are leading boycott, divestment, and sanctions in a shadow institutional structure. So what I would like to do is revisit a history where this was the case, where the PLO was at the center of these movements and articulating, when you say Palestine, you mean resistance. When you say Palestine, you mean struggle. And the moment that that was forged most vividly was during the apex of third world upheaval, and especially in what we've come to term and now re-articulate as Black Palestinian solidarity. So I'd like to revisit that a little bit to say where it's been and where we've come back to and why it's relevant for the future. The 1967 war. Can I move this? As you can see, I like to move. Oh, it's stuck. I'm sorry. Okay. I'll just move around. The 1967 war, which indelibly transformed the Middle East political geography in the context of a rising global tide against imperial domination, proved to be a watershed movement for Black Palestinian solidarity. The war established a new status quo that recast Israel as a colonial power in alignment with the United States, Portugal, and apartheid South Africa. It also catalyzed Palestinian militant groups to take the helm of the Palestinian Liberation Organization from the control of Arab states and redefine it as a national liberation struggle. Under Yasser Arafat's leadership, the PLO centered the armed struggle as a primary form of resistance and joined the global uprising led by the Third World Movement, and the Palestinian struggle would become a principal part of its revolutionary agenda. The self-described third world sought to create an alternative trajectory than that which was offered by the two worlds in this Cold War. Newly independent states and ongoing national liberation movements constituted this project and engaged in guerrilla warfare as well as fervent battles within the United Nations. By 1960, their efforts culminated in a UN declaration on the granting of independence to colonial countries and peoples that condemned colonialism as an illegitimate form of governance and equated self-determination with a legal right to national independence. The Third World Project struggled for independence, but as Edom Getachew shows, the bid for revolution not only sought to remove colonial powers, but to append imperial circuits of capital that flowed through a colonial geography. It considered empire as a structure of international racial hierarchy and decolonization as a predicate element in a broader process of establishing a new egalitarian world order. Internationalism then, like transnationalism today, has signified an anti-imperial analytic and a bid for world-making. Black internationalism as a political imaginary had developed well before 1967, but the Third World Revolt thrust Palestine, in the words of historian Russell Rickford, onto the terrain of Black consciousness. The Second World War, which demonstrated the vulnerability of colonial powers, led American Blacks to reject American exceptionalism and illuminated the co-constitutive relationship between global white supremacy and imperialism. This radical current in Black thought considered meaningful inclusion in the United States as insufficient because equality alone would leave imperialism and the U.S. at its helm intact. U.S. white supremacy, they argued, was tied to a global system of racial capitalism that necessitated a project of decolonization to achieve Black liberation. These politics aligned a Black radical current with ongoing struggles for national liberation and more generally the Third World Project. In this context, Israel's status as a new imperial power in the Middle East following the 1967 war, together with its proximity to the United States and its role in supporting apartheid South Africa, as well as its extractive policies of resources from the African continent, led some Black organizations, including the Student National Coordinating Committee and the Black Panther Party, to openly criticize Israel and to embrace the Palestinian struggle. The PLO was often at the helm of this anti-imperialist struggle, with groups like the SNCC, and the BPP identified. It helped legislate new laws of war for irregular combat to legitimize the use of force by guerrilla fighters, thus establishing the right to fight. In 1975, Fayez Sayegh, a U.S.-trained academic and founding director of the Palestine Research Center in Beirut, led an effort to incorporate Zionism into the decade the decade for action to combat racism and racial discrimination, initiated to delegitimize apartheid rule in South Africa. And the effort culminated in UN General Assembly Resolution 3379, declaring Zionism as a form of racism and racial discrimination. The resolution formalized a racial theory of Zionist settler colonization as a white supremacist project aimed at, quote, in Sayegh's words, racial elimination, and explicitly connected the Palestinian liberation struggle to ongoing struggles in the African continent. In this context of vibrant Afro-Arab solidarity, the PLO, and mostly its leftist elements, demonstrably expressed Palestinians' joint struggle with Black liberation by hosting Black leftists and delegations to the Middle East, collaborating with them in international conferences, and publishing in their newsletters. At its apex, Black Palestinian solidarity reflected a political commitment amongst radical currents of Black and Palestinian organizations. As Robin D.G. Kelly emphasizes, it was, quote, a Black left, a political minority that extended solidarity to the Palestinian left based on a radical anti-imperialist agenda. In the crucible of Third World upheaval, solidarity was based on this anti-imperial framework that melded anti-colonialism and anti-racist struggles from within the United States and beyond. This revolutionary epic began its steady decline in the early 1980s when the FBI's counterintelligence program decimated the Black radical movement, and Israel's invasion of Lebanon routed the PLO from its headquarters in Beirut. Globally, anti-colonial fervor waned as once revolutionary leaders transformed into autocrats that squash social movements and political opponents in a bid to consolidate their own rule. Perhaps the final chapters of this era unfolded in the early 1990s, when the dissolution of the Soviet Union signaled the end of the Cold War, and when the Third World achieved two of its greatest victories, Namibian independence and the dismantlement of apartheid in South Africa. And the question of Palestine, arguably the last vestige of the Third World's agenda, anti-colonial agenda, was also resolved during this time. In 1993, the PLO entered into the Oslo peace process, wherein it formally recognized Israel, renounced armed resistance, and rescinded the 1975 UN resolution condemning Zionism in exchange for autonomous regions without the guarantee of sovereignty. In the late 1980s, at the height of the Palestinian Intifada, the Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza was envisioned as a solution for freedom, as a solution and a pathway to freedom, and the PLO endorsed entering into direct negotiations with Israel. But even the most ardent supporters of the peace process vehemently rejected the terms of the Declaration of Principles, better known as the Oslo Accords, signed by Israel and the PLO in 1993. The late Edward Said has summarized this best when he explains, quote, "Let us call the agreement by its real name, an instrument of Palestinian surrender, a Palestinian Versailles." PLO Chairman Arafat banned Said's collected essays, Peace and Its Discontents, condemning the Oslo Accords from the Palestinian territories. Within less than 7 years, the collapse of the peace process vindicated Said. By 2019, its failure has become empirically undeniable. Settlers have increased from 200,000 in 1993 to 600,000, and the settlements have carved the West Bank into more than 20 non-contiguous Bantustans. 85% of the wall's length runs through the West Bank and confiscates 13% of it. Israeli military law prohibits the presence and travel of Palestinians between the West Bank and Gaza, thereby entrenching their political and geographic fragmentation. And in Gaza, Israel has securitized nearly 2 million Palestinians and held them captive under a land siege and naval blockade since Hamas won in parliamentary elections in 2006. Israel torpedoed the possibility of a Palestinian state, not in spite of Oslo, but precisely because of it. Worse, the Palestinian struggle, once a touchstone of global anti-imperial struggle, has since 1993 become ensconced within a peacemaking and national security framework, and with it, fervent Black Palestinian solidarity has folded in collapsed internationalism. But the concurrent bombardment of Gaza and the occupation of Ferguson in the summer 2014 has appended this status quo. During the beginning of the assault on Gaza, the largest scale assault since 2004, when the assaults began. There's been about 22 between 2004 and 2014, but only 3 of the largest scale assaults are the ones that we recognize because of their use of these weapons of destruction. In 3 weeks into that onslaught, Officer Darren Wilson shot to kill Michael Brown, an unarmed 18-year-old Black teenager, six times above the waist, twice in the head. Wilson then left Brown's bleeding body out in the grueling Missouri heat for 4 hours before the watchful and terrorized eyes of Ferguson's predominantly Black community. Brown's killing was the latest in a series of the killing of Black boys, men, women, and girls by agents of the states or vigilantes with near impunity, and prompted a national convergence upon Ferguson. Local and state law enforcement placed Ferguson under occupation, which featured, in the United States, military-style weapons, including body armor, camouflage uniforms, 5.56 millimeter rifles based on the M4 carbine design, side pistols with extra magazines, tear gas masks, and Humvees. The tactics, weapons, and violence were all too familiar to Palestinians who were watching this, who began to tweet messages of support from Palestine and within the United States of how to withstand the tear gas. Stand close to the officers so that they can't throw the tear gas on you. Carry onions with you. Bring magnesium so that you can protect your eyes. As Marbre Stali Butts, a movement lawyer on the ground in Ferguson, explains, quote, "The U.S. provided the weapons, Israel provided the tactics. The two countries exchanged and shared the carceral and military technologies for repressing their undesirable populations." Protesters in Ferguson soon held up signs that read, "We are Gaza." From this show of solidarity in the summer of 2014, a practice of solidarity has developed, featuring delegations, featuring joint campaigns, successful campaigns like in Durham, North Carolina, where activists have forced police units to stop sending their officers to be trained in Israel. Activists in the United States have prevented concerts from taking place in Israel, athletes from traveling to Israel after NFL championships. This is the work that is being done by these transnational networks that now exist, that continue to keep this question of Palestine alive as a resistance struggle, as an anti-imperialist struggle. The political moment starkly illuminates once again status-based approaches from revolutionary struggles aimed at alternative futures. So what does that mean when we say alternative futures? We know almost for certain what an Israeli future looks like, what Israelification means. Pursuit of racial self-segregation, purity, supremacy as explicit policy. When the Israeli Knesset passed the nation-state law in July 2018 enshrining that only Jews had the right to self-determination in Palestine and made colonial settlement a constitutional obligation, it was Richard Spencer, a leader of the white supremacist movement in the United States and a figurehead, to say that Israel was, quote, paving a path for European sovereignty. Technologies to achieve and preserve this kind of sovereignty includes militarized walls, surveillance, torture, lethal force against unarmed protesters, socially and legally imposed segregation, armed civilian settlers protected by the state, and forced deportation of asylum seekers. And this is not just a condition Palestinians endure in Israel, and Palestine, at the hands of Israelis. The Donald Trump administration is consecrating this future for the United States. In fact, the Committee on Homeland Security and Government Affairs of the United States Senate, chaired by Senator Ron Johnson, authored the report to, quote, compare Israeli security experiences to the security policies of the United States, seeing as there is much the United States can learn from Israel, as Secretary Kelly and the Trump administration take important steps in securing our homeland. What Israel is doing to Palestinians, it is universalizing to be used against populations all over the world, hand in hand with the United States and other colonial powers. And the exports to which Israel is exporting this to include what we know from investigations by the Privacy International detail that Israeli surveillance companies have equipped security forces with internet monitoring technologies in Trinidad and Tobago and Uganda. Agencies in Panama and Mexico have reportedly been customers of intrusion technology. It includes companies for phone and internet monitoring to policies to countries like Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, as well as security forces in Cambodia. Israel increases its selling power of these weapons by boasting that its technologies are tested. And they mean that they're tested on Palestinians. They attend international weapons fairs and brag that this is Defense Shield tested. This is Operation Cast Lead tested. Our death is making them more profitable. These references have become so global that it's not only Ferguson protesters who identify as Gaza, but in several favelas in Brazil, where state violence and high and living conditions are horrific, the residents refer to themselves as living in the Gaza Strip. Indeed, the challenges Palestinians face is the challenge that many communities are facing, where a police state with advanced weapons technologies enforces an outright policy of ultra-nationalism and supremacy. So what next? We know what the Israeli future looks like, but we do not yet know what the Palestinian one looks like. One path forward is to continue insisting upon establishing an independent state, despite the empirical evidence, despite the intervening decades since the height of anti-colonial fervor, demonstrating the limits of nationalism, as liberation leaders have transformed into despots, and the promise of alternative futures once made by the Third World have been enfolded into violent and nationalist neoliberal trends. What the Martinican writer, fighter, and psychologist Frantz Fanon cautioned when he tells his brethren, quote, if we want humanity to advance a step farther, if we want to bring it up to a different level than that which Europe has shown it, then we must invent and we must make new discoveries. Indeed, self-determination has at least two meanings, many more, but at least two. a juridical meaning in the form of a state, and a metaphysical meaning that only we as a people can define for ourselves. And Palestinians continue to pursue both routes. And we are trying to figure out, those as part of a transnational network and a shadow transnational network of Palestinian activists are trying to figure out what it looks like to be free in the excess of a state. It's what makes the alliance with Black Americans in particular so salient, because like them, a civilizational world order has left us behind, and our attempts to catch up simply for national independence, but not as it was during our moment of anti-colonial revolt, should be a struggle for world making, and not merely a state. So we must think our futures anew. This means thinking about how Palestinian freedom is not just about Palestinian, but offers freedom for everyone. Indeed, at the edge of this juncture facing Palestinians is the possibility of how do we get free beyond a nation-state framework, and how we lift everyone else with us. If we can figure that out as Palestinians, we will be able to offer answers not just for ourselves, but for the rest of the world and humanity as well. And nothing is more noble, righteous, and worthwhile than that. We are all Gaza, and we can all be free. Thank you.